So in one sutta, the Buddha said that one cannot develop the right view if one hasn't grasped the sign of his own mind. And one cannot grasp the sign of his own mind if one has not become accomplished in solitude, hasn't been dwelling in physical seclusion. So what is then the sign of the mind? Well, in brief terms, it's really just learning how to discern your own mind as an enduring thing right here, right now. Usually people can discern and have such attitude and see things as things on the level of their own senses only, on the level of the sense objects. So even then, so that's kind of the standard of the way things would be attended to. The measure of thingness of what it is, it's pretty much what you can access and see and perceive through your five senses. So, but the mind is not, it's not on that level. When people turn then that type of attention that's been cultivated on the level of sense objects, when they turn that type of attention to their own mind, it's not the mind that they see. It's pretty much another assumed thing on the level, and that assumption is still on the level of the sense objects. So then that which is the mind there at the time, it's not seen, because the mind does not appear on the level of the five senses. And the mind is certainly not an object of the senses in the same, an ear cannot hear itself and eyes cannot see itself. So the problem is then when people turn to try to discern and investigate the mind, their tools are tools of their senses, which they use to, find the mind. The tools of the sense objects, and they're simply not compatible for the domain where the mind exists. So that's the whole citta nimitta, the nimitta, the signs and features. See, that's something that is that cannot be accessed directly through the attention that you used to cultivate it towards sense objects, like me, the subject, here is the object, I'm attentive to it, I'm examining it, I'm looking at the details of it, I'm figuring it out. That only works on the level of relationship between sense object. So, and that's pretty much, yes, all the modern science, the various branches of it, it's always the same principle. Observer and the observed. So that principle does not work if you want to understand your mind, because the mind cannot be observed as an object. So that's why people do realize this, people who have tried, and they get an inkling that it doesn't quite work. The approach, the tools you use to investigate and figure out the mind, they're not quite compatible. But then that's when people kind of fall into the other sort of extreme, let's say like that, which is when they start to mystify it then. They start to mystify the mind as that which is always there and it's always present, and the knower, the watcher, the observer, whatever else it is, implying that it can be left alone on that ambiguous level and sort of given some sort of higher role of some mystical entity that it's well, again, that again results in the same level of not knowing what that mind actually is. So grasping the signs of the mind that the Buddha talks about is something that's then in between. So it's in between observance of the sense object, and it's in between of mystifying that background, that what's behind that observer. It's understanding what is there enduring as phenomena, as we often say. So how to see the mind as phenomena? Well, that's that nimitta part whereby you start to discern signs and features of it. Because signs and features are always secondary, are always peripheral to the thing that you're directly observing. So even on the level of that relationship between observer and the observed, senses and the sense objects, when you're looking at something, what that thing means, what that thing implies, what that thing signifies, is not what you're seeing. So when you look at the sign that says stop, the simplest example often used in philosophy, you are seeing the shape, the color, the sign, the letters. But see, the meaning now of that word that you are perceiving is not what you're seeing with your eyes, is what you know with your mind simultaneously there. And what is that meaning? Well, that meaning is do not cross this. Do not go past this point. Or whatever else it means. That meaning is found peripheral to what you're looking at. And the only reason the meaning is there is because that's where the mind is there. So learning to see these signs and features without having to attend to them directly on the level of that observer, observed, sense objects, senses, sense objects, is how you're learning to discern nimitta, the phenomenon of nimitta, recognizing that there are such things that exist peripherally, only when I don't look at them directly. Only when I don't attend to them, they exist for what they are as such. If you were to say, attend now to one of those nimittas, to one of those significances, meanings, implications that you know, that will become then the object of your attention, the object of your senses. So in other words, something else now would be a nimitta to that. Something else would now be the peripheral significance of what you are looking at directly as an object of your attention. So the mind, in that sense, the mind is always peripheral. The mind is always on the level of where those nimittas, significances and features are. So learning how to see signs and features of any phenomena does not mean examining signs and features in the detail and learning the information about them. It means seeing them as phenomena, seeing them on the level that they are, without giving into that pressure to attend to them and examine them on the level of sense observation that you would do with your eyes or in like a scientific experiment. And that's how you cultivate your mind. Then that's the whole, like the context we often talk about. Context is something that's always peripheral. So the whole practice of discerning nimittas is pretty much the correct practice of mindfulness, where your mindfulness is not on the level of attending to the moment-to-moment experience, but it's on the level of knowing the significance of currently enduring experience as such. And then refraining from attending to it, as in refraining from overly trying to access it, and refraining from mystifying it. Like you realize you can't access it directly, so then you mystify it. You make it more than it actually is. But in reality, it exists as such, as a peripheral phenomena there with everything else. So significances of your sight, sound, smell, taste, touches are all nimittas of sight, sound, smell, taste, touches. And now, if you learn how to see nimittas on the level of sight, sound, smell, taste, touches, this enduring body here, the significances, if you train your mind in that peripheral recognition, exactly, you're training your mind by default in regard to anything. So sooner or later, these nimittas, there's nothing mystical about them, by the way, we covered that in previous talks. So these significances will now start to be seen even in regard to the mind. So the features, the characteristics, the implications of the mind that endures there as a thing, as a phenomena, this sense of an individual, you can say observer. There's no need to deny that the unity that observes, so to speak. You just need to see the signs and features of that. You just need to see what is peripheral to that, which is generally quite ambiguous and peripheral for somebody who is too dependent on their sense objects. So that's why the whole prerequisite for discerning this level of subtlety of signs and features in regard to the mind, that prerequisite is pretty much the like sense restraint, guarding of the sense doors, and then dwelling in physical seclusion, like being completely alone. Then that which the mind is emerge as a thing there. Peripheral thing, again, you don't need to stop looking or learn how to see it with your eyes and so on, because it's impossible. It completely exists in its own domain, that it's inaccessible to your five senses, but it's there as such, as a domain inaccessible to the five senses that you can know. So the practice then of mindfulness is the practice of seeing the state of the mind enduring there for what it is, as such, on its own with this external world of the senses and sense objects. So whether you are thinking about the mind and the thoughts, specific thoughts, whether you are absorbed into the sense objects through your senses, the mind is there enduring as such on a peripheral level. And if you have trained in the discernment of the peripheral, you will be seeing it, doesn't matter how far that phenomenon is within you, it is still here and now. Whatever else is going on in front of you, that mind endures as such. So discerning the Chitta Nimitta means discerning the signs and features of the mind, means seeing the mind as a phenomena independent of you that endures on its own level. See, people can sort of try to apply the view that, oh yes, this mind doesn't belong to me, nothing is myself, it's just there like a thing. But that view is practically and usually and most commonly applied through the assumptions of sense and sense objects. That's the measure of existence. So when somebody too dependent on the sense objects thinks about this level of subtle existence, they won't see it. So when they refer to the mind from the point of view of their assumptions in the view, they just refer to it as another external object that's on the level of the observation by their senses. And that's why even in the whole, science, the Western science in particular, the whole relationship with like the mind, consciousness, thoughts always will boil down to some, physical and chemical presence and balances and hormones and things that you can measure and observe, assuming that that's where the mind is, because there is nothing else that you can see with your eyes. There is nothing else. You can be narrowing it down to the smallest particles and particulars. And since there's nothing else that you can see, the natural assumption will assume, that's the center in the brain for the consciousness or the mind or whatever else it is. Failing to understand that the principle of observation already requires your mind being there that cannot be seen on that level. And that's something that a scientist, Western scientist, would be thoroughly ignorant of and unaware of. So the practice of mindfulness is not about merging the approach of the science and the Buddha's teaching. The practice of mindfulness is completely overcoming the pressure of attending to things as a measure of existence and seeing what is peripheral to it, what are the signs and features of the pressure of the measure of existence of my sense objects. Because even the sense dependence and sensuality and attending to the objects of your senses requires the mind being there, and signs and features of that are always accessible and visible. So physical seclusion then is pretty much the practice whereby you are not engaging too much or too distractingly with the external world, upon which, by the way, your views still depend, because nobody starts enlightened. You already start dependent on the sense objects, dependent on the world, depending on over-attending as the measure of the normal attending, and you don't see anything peripheral. So withdrawal and physical seclusion and dwelling in non-company and all of that, upon, the proper virtue and sense restraint and guarding of the sense doors, that then becomes your practice of through that through not overly engaging with the external world, you still operate in that solitude, and then you get to see, then in like the movements, the thoughts you have, the perceptions you have, you start to discern that unity of the mind as a container, as a framework of all these particular engagements that you have of a neutral kind with the sense objects through your senses. So that's what dwelling in solitude is necessary, because it takes time to discern that framework of seeing, smelling, tasting, touching, standing, walking, and so on. And that framework is not to be mystified, but to be understood on the level that it is, which is the level of the peripheral. It's always peripheral. It's always at the background of that which you are looking at, that which you are smelling, that which you are tasting, that which you are touching. And you are always doing some of these things. Senses are there operating in the world. So pretty much discerning the signs of the mind means discerning the domain that is wider and more primordial, not first, but more fundamental in a sense. It's the container to the domain of the senses. And that's why the mind comes first, as the suttas and Dhammapada would say. The framework, the mood, the direction of your mind, the intent, all these things are on the level of the mind, and all those things pretty much determine your behavior, determine your engagement with the senses and everything else. So that's why that is the prerequisite for understanding the escape from suffering, the Four Noble Truths for becoming a Sotapanna. When you're trying to understand the mind and when you're trying to get into the details of it, that which your mind is peripheral to that experience of your effort to understand the mind. So, in other words, whatever you've been attending with your perception and with your mind, you discern signs and features of that you're not attending at the same time, and on that level is where your mind is. So training to see that without needing to look at it, that's the whole practice. And the more you develop that, the steadier that image becomes, the less perturbable that image becomes, which means the more composure your mind has, the better samadhi has been developed. And when that samadhi is sufficient, when that imperturbability is sufficient, when that knowledge of the signs and features of the mind, knowledge of the mind as a phenomena, seeing the mind for what it is on the level that it is without needing to attend it, overly attending, under-attended, and all of these sort of mistaken efforts around it, seeing it for what it is the prerequisite then for seeing the escape from suffering. Why? Because if you see the mind for what it is, as a thing enduring there, truly, on its own, as a phenomenon, without your interference, that's already a form of seeing anatta, understanding impermanence, understanding the non-ownership of it, and above all, seeing the gratuity of the craving that implies the ownership, that implies that directionality that comes from your mind. So seeing the mind as a phenomena is a prerequisite for uprooting the craving, and that's why fully developing the knowledge of the Citta Nimitta results in the right view, which means results in fully understanding what cessation of craving would be and what complete freedom from suffering would entail and imply. So physical solitude, for which it is a prerequisite for that sign, developing the signs of the mind, seeing them correctly, for which, as I said many times before, sense restraint, moderation in eating, guarding of the sense doors, watchfulness, keeping obviously the precepts and the virtues is an absolute must, because you will not be dwelling in solitude rightly if you haven't been practicing these things correctly beforehand. So it's not just a question of, oh, I'll just go and lock myself alone, because you would still be attending to things wrongly, and you will not have enough mental strength to resist the pull of the attention that's dependent on the sense objects because of the, all the current ignorance and prior lack of sense restraint and chasing of the pleasure of the sense objects and so on. So that's why, in order to be able to dwell in solitude correctly, you need to have been, properly established in virtue, guarding of the sense doors, and taken that as a training, not as some sort of behavior and level of observance that I would do so that then the enlightenment would happen to me, but as a direct training of, no, this is the point. The point is to train every day of my life in not giving in to certain things, in not making certain choices and acting out of them, and so on. So that's already the form of development and the form of strengthening that container, which then when you take into solitude, you will get to properly benefit from. So then the mind would emerge, the shapes of it, the contours, the peripheral sort of signs and features of that basis of the framework that endures that living individual, that observer, that everything else is now seen there at the same time as not something that belongs to you. Because it takes a sufficient amount of that development of that peripheral mindfulness, where you learn how to see things without needing to look directly at them, to get to see the mind on that peripheral level enduring, same like the things in the world that you look at, smell, taste and touch. When that's fully developed, that's pretty much, there is absolutely no room then left for any passion, aversion and distraction to arise. In other words, there will be no room left for any craving to be manifested, and that's in itself is just end of sensuality and suffering and any adversity. Pretty much, that's it.